The rhythm of rain was as important as the turning of the seasons. And the seasons themselves, though gentle in this greenhouse world, still marked the passage of time. Even without harsh winters, there were cycles, dry and wet, growth and dormancy. Trees dropped leaves, not from cold, but from exhaustion, conserving energy during less favorable months. When the rains returned, buds opened again, and the forest resumed its slow breathing. The animals followed these cues instinctively, migrating or nesting in harmony with the pulse of the environment. The insects were the unsung engineers of this world, pollinators, decomposers, scavengers. They worked continuously to maintain the system. Without them, the flowering plants would have failed to spread. Without the decomposers, fallen vegetation would have smothered the soil. The dinosaurs may have ruled visibly, but the green world answered to smaller masters. Each leaf carried evidence of their work. Tiny holes from feeding, trails of larvae, grains of pollen that drifted unseen through the air. It is fascinating to imagine the colors of that world. Unlike the gray-green monotony we often picture from reconstructions, the Cretaceous landscape would have been vibrant. Flowers added splashes of yellows, reds, and whites among the ferns. Tree bark carried hues of deep brown, orange, and gray. Insects flashed metallic blues and greens as they moved. Feathers shimmered in sunlight. Even fruits and seeds came in bright shades designed to attract attention. The planet was experimenting with color, testing how sight could shape evolution. Fossilized leaves from this era show intricate details, veins, textures, and sometimes even the imprints of raindrops. They reveal that plant life had developed complex structures to regulate water and gas exchange. Stomata, the tiny openings on leaves, adapted to varying levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, balancing the intake of air with the loss of moisture. These microscopic adjustments determined how efficiently the green world could function. Every living thing, no matter how large or small, depended on this invisible chemistry. In some regions, the forest gave way to open plains where different forms of vegetation took over. Here, the tall ferns and cycads formed a continuous sea of green that stretched to the horizon. The ground was spongy from decayed matter, the air full of insect noise. Herds of herbivores roamed these spaces, feeding and moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Their grazing kept the vegetation in check, preventing any one species from dominating. The balance between plant and animal was mutual, each controlling and supporting the other. Occasionally, fire swept through these plains, ignited by lightning strikes. The flames moved quickly, consuming dry foliage, but the plants were adapted to it. Some seeds only germinated after being exposed to heat. Within weeks of a fire, green shoots would appear again, nourished by the ashes of the old. This cycle of destruction and renewal was another form of the planet's pulse, quieter than the movement of tectonic plates, but just as vital. The green world extended to the edges of the seas as well. Along the coasts, mangrove-like forests and salt-tolerant plants created dense thicket. Their roots stabilized the soil and filtered the water that flowed from rivers into the ocean. These ecosystems were nurseries for fish and amphibians, connecting the land and the sea. The boundaries of the green world were never fixed. They shifted with the tides, blending one environment into another. Even underground, the influence of plants was profound. Roots reached deep into rock, breaking it apart and releasing minerals into the soil. This process, known as weathering, played a crucial role in regulating the planet's atmosphere. As roots and microbes dissolved rock, they helped capture carbon dioxide and store it in new minerals. It was a slow but powerful feedback loop. The green world breathing with the planet itself. The dinosaurs lived within this system, not above it. Their lives depended entirely on the reliability of plant growth. When drought struck, populations fell. When volcanic ash enriched the soil, they flourished. The stability of the green world determined everything. It provided food, shelter, and air. It was the invisible foundation of their age. And though we often think of the Cretaceous in terms of its great animals, it was this web of plant life that truly defined it. Without the forests, there would have been no herds, no migration, no predators. Every roar, every call, every movement of muscle and bone began with sunlight striking a leaf. The green world was the silent engine behind the nation. Spectacle of life. The plants of the Cretaceous left behind more than fossils. They left behind the blueprint of modern ecosystems. The forests of today, their structure, their diversity, their chemistry, are echoes of that ancient age. The same relationships that began then continue now. Every flower pollinated, every leaf that falls and decays, every breath of oxygen we take is part of the legacy of that green world. And still beneath the endless canopy and the weight of leaves, the earth continued to move. The soil shifted, the air warmed, the balance wavered slightly, unseen. The creatures of that world did not notice. They lived in the rhythm of growth and hunger, migration and rest. All of it synchronized with the great breathing of the planet itself. The green world carried on, its leaves whispering in the wind, its roots deep in the moving earth, unaware that its age of glory would soon give way to something far darker. Not by its own failure, but by a chance event from beyond the sky. The forest of the Cretaceous stretched endlessly, alive with color and movement. But above the canopy, across the plains, and along the wide floodplains, there was a presence that commanded all attention. The giants. They were the largest creatures ever to walk the earth. Vast bodies of muscle and bone that moved with a weight and grace that defied imagination. To live in the Cretaceous was to live in the shadow of titans. They were not mythical, not exaggerated legends, but real animals whose size alone shaped the environment around them. The green world supported them, and they in turn shaped it. Every path they walked became a trail. Every tree they fed on altered the structure of the forest. They were gardeners on a scale no other creatures could match, consuming tons of vegetation each day, spreading seeds across miles, and creating new openings for sunlight to reach the forest floor. The balance between the earth and its giants was fragile, yet it held for millions of years. If you could stand at the edge of a late Cretaceous plain, you might first hear them before you saw them. The sound was not a roar or a stomp, but a deep vibration, the low rhythmic thud of enormous feet pressing into the ground. The air would tremble slightly, carrying the sound of heavy breathing and the soft swish of tails sweeping through tall ferns. Then, emerging through the haze, you would see them, long-necked titanosaurs moving in slow procession, their heads rising and falling above the vegetation like ships at sea. These sauropods were the ultimate expression of the dinosaur body plan. Their necks stretched for meters, their bodies massive but balanced, their legs thick and columnar like tree trunks. The largest among them weighed as much as 70 tons, and yet their skeletons were masterpieces of engineering, lightened by air pockets within the bone, allowing them to move with surprising efficiency. They were warm-blooded enough to sustain constant activity, but slow enough to conserve energy. Each step was deliberate, each breath deep and steady. Around them, smaller herbivores moved with quicker, sharper rhythms. Hadrosaurs grazed in herds, their duck-billed snouts sweeping through the low vegetation. They were social creatures, communicating through deep calls that carried across long distances. Fossilized crests found on some species show that they could produce resonant sounds, possibly to signal danger or coordinate movement. Their young stayed close to their sides, protected within the massive bodies that moved like a living wall. Further north, herds of Triceratops wandered the floodplains. Their frilled heads and horns made them unmistakable, and their behavior likely mirrored that of modern herd animals. They were powerful but cautious, their senses tuned to the approach of predators. The horns were not just weapons, but tools of communication, displays of dominance, recognition, or even affection. When they locked horns, the sound would echo through the valley, a deep grinding of bone and muscle that left scars even on the fossilized skulls we find today. Predators watched from the edges of this abundance. The most famous among them, Tyrannosaurus Rex, was both feared and misunderstood. It was massive, yes, but not reckless. Its body was built for bursts of speed, not endurance. Its sense of smell was among the most acute of any animal in history, capable of detecting prey from miles away. Its bite was strong enough to crush bone. Yet, its behavior was not that of a mindless killer. It was an opportunist, a strategist. Sometimes it hunted, sometimes it scavenged. It was a creature finely tuned to the balance of its world. To see a Tyrannosaurus in motion would have been to witness a perfect combination of power and control. The muscles of its legs coiled and released with precision. Its tail counterbalanced every movement. Its head swung side to side as it advanced, eyes locked on motion. There was no wasted effort. Every step was an act of intention. And yet, for all its power, it existed within the same limits as everything else, dependent on the availability of prey, on the fertility of the land, on the pulse of the planet that fed its world. The Age of Titans was not defined by violence, though it contained plenty of it. It was defined by scale. Everything in the Cretaceous seemed larger. The animals, the trees, even the insects. Evolution had found a rhythm that favored size. In warm climates, with high oxygen levels and abundant food, bodies could grow immense without strain. Larger animals retained heat better, could travel farther, and could defend themselves more effectively. Size was both a strategy and a symptom of success. But the size came with consequences. The great herbivores needed constant access to food and water. Their migration shaped the landscape as surely as rivers did. When they moved, they trampled paths that became seasonal corridors, used again and again for generations. Plants along these paths evolved thicker bark or faster growth to recover from the constant feeding. The soil itself was turned and mixed by their weight, aerated by their steps, fertilized by their droppings. The giants were not separate from the ecosystem. They were part of its metabolism. In many ways, the world revolved around them. The predators follow their movements. Scavengers fed on their remains. Insects bred in their waste. Even the plants had adapted to their feeding patterns. The Age of Titans was a living system, and every heartbeat, every sound, every shadow belonged to that system. At night, the landscape changed. The heat of the day faded, replaced by the steady chorus of insects. The larger animals rested, their silhouettes faintly visible against the moonlit sky. Steam rose from the ground where their warm bodies had lain. Somewhere in the darkness, smaller predators hunted, taking advantage of the stillness. The world of giants did not sleep completely. It only slowed. In the southern continents, the diversity of these titans was extraordinary. South America, in particular, was home to some of the largest creatures that ever lived. Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, and Dreadnought moved through ancient floodplains like living mountains. Their fossils show that they traveled in groups, perhaps for protection, perhaps simply because the land could only sustain them if they moved together, feeding and moving on in cycles. Their long necks allowed them to feed on trees that would have been unreachable to smaller herbivores, and their sheer size made them nearly immune to attack. Few predators dared to challenge an adult titan. In Africa, similar giants roamed, though the species differed. The environment was drier there, dotted with wide rivers and seasonal wetlands. The dinosaurs adapted accordingly, with more efficient water retention and varied feeding strategies. Some may have migrated seasonally, following the rains. The air shimmered with heat during the day, and dust hung low near the horizon. Yet, even in that harshness, life thrived, bound together by the same patterns of abundance and struggle. Asia was home to an astonishing variety of dinosaurs, from the towering herbivores to agile predators that hunted in groups. Fossils reveal evidence of coordinated hunting, trackways showing multiple individuals moving together in parallel, their footprints preserved in ancient mud. Intelligence, once thought to belong only to small creatures, was a force among the large as well. Predators had to plan to anticipate the behavior of prey. The green world was not only a stage for instinct, but for strategy. In the forests of North America, the ecosystem was a patchwork of habitats. Rivers, floodplains, wooded hills. Each supported its own caste of creatures. In one region, hydrosaurs grazed on low vegetation. In another, ceratopsians clashed among the ferns. Tyrannosaurs prowled at the edges of both, their keen senses guiding them through the landscape. The constant interplay between hunter and prey created an evolutionary arms race that refined every adaptation. Speed, camouflage, armor, intelligence. Even the smallest details of this world reflected its scale. The nests of large herbivores were massive, shallow depressions lined with vegetation, often clustered together in nesting grounds that stretched for kilometers. Fossilized eggs and embryos show that some species cared for their young after hatching, bringing food and guarding them from predators. The bond between parent and offspring, once thought to be rare in prehistoric life, was already a defining behavior. The continuity of generations depended on care, not just reproduction. The predators, too, showed signs of complexity. The bones of injured individuals sometimes show evidence of healing, suggesting that they survived long enough to recover, possibly with help from others of their kind. This points to cooperation, social structure, even empathy, in forms we can't easily imagine. The Age of Titans was not simply about might. It was about adaptation at every level, physical and social alike. The climate sustained this abundance, but it was beginning to change. The hidden pulse of the planet, the volcanic activity deep beneath the crust, had been steadily altering the composition of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated, causing subtle shifts in temperature and rainfall. Some regions grew wetter, others drier. The great inland seas that once covered vast areas began to shrink in some places and expand in others. Slowly, ecosystems adjusted. The dinosaurs moved with them, following the food, following the water, unaware that the balance was tilting. In the fossil record, these transitions are faint but visible. Layers of sediment record alternating patterns of flood and drought. Plant fossils show changes in dominant species. Flowering plants becoming more common, conifers retreating. The world was evolving, not through sudden catastrophe yet, but through quiet persistence. The giants continued to roam, unaware that they were living in the closing chapter of their age. At their peak, the diversity of dinosaurs was staggering. There were armored forms with plates and spikes, agile runners built for speed, giants that grazed the canopy, and tiny scavengers that darted through the undergrowth. Each was perfectly adapted to its environment. Evolution had refined the design of the dinosaur over 160 million years, optimizing it for almost every conceivable niche. It is difficult to overstate how successful they were. The Earth had become theirs entirely. The Age of Titans was not only a biological era, but a geological and atmospheric balance that made such creatures possible. The high oxygen content supported their metabolism. The warm, stable temperatures allowed them to breed and grow year-round. The plentiful vegetation sustained their endless hunger. Every aspect of the environment aligned to create a world capable of supporting life on an unprecedented scale. Yet within that perfection lay vulnerability. The same interconnectedness that made the world so rich also made it fragile. A disruption in one system, the climate, the atmosphere, the plant life, could ripple through everything. The Titans, for all their power, were bound to the balance that sustained them. They could not adapt quickly to a world that shifted too fast. Still, in their time, they were the unchallenged rulers of Earth. They shaped the planet simply by existing. Their footprints pressed deep into the mud, leaving impressions that would harden into fossils, preserved through the ages. Their bones would become part of the Earth's stone, waiting for discovery. Even their breath, rich with carbon dioxide, fed the forests that surrounded them. They were part of the planet's circulation, the living manifestation of its strength. If you could stand among them, you might feel small, but also strangely connected. The air vibrating with the low calls of massive creatures, the ground trembling under their weight, the warmth of sunlight filtering through the haze. All of it would feel alive in a way that is difficult to comprehend. Now the scale of that life, the density of it, the sense of being surrounded by living mass would have been overwhelming. The Age of Titans was not a moment of chaos or domination. It was a period of balance, the culmination of millions of years of evolution. The planet had created its masterpiece, vast, breathing ecosystems, powered by sunlight, fueled by growth, held together by the invisible rhythm of the Earth. It was a world at its most alive, and still beneath it all, the ground continued to move. The pulse of the planet never stopped. The atmosphere shifted slightly. The seas deepened. Far beyond the clouds, something small and distant moved through the dark of space. Unnoticed, insignificant against the stars, the Titans went on feeding, breathing, living, unaware that their world, for all its strength, was not built to last forever. The Cretaceous world had been thriving for millions of years. The forests were dense, the seas were full, the air was rich and warm. The great creatures of land, sky, and water had settled into a long equilibrium, unaware that anything could ever disturb it. Every day began the same way, sunlight spreading across misted valleys, insects lifting into the air, herds stirring in the early heat. To them, this world must have seemed eternal. But time, even then, was counting down. The last age of the dinosaurs was not yet ending, but it was already late. The final midnight was approaching quietly, hidden behind the illusion of stability. If you could have stood in that time, nothing would have looked wrong. The earth was alive in every direction. Trees stretched into humid air. Volcanoes smoldered faintly on distant horizons. The seas shimmered with the same light that had reflected off them for ages. Animals moved through their daily cycles, feeding, nesting, migrating, all according to patterns that had worked for millions of generations. The earth did not warn them. There was no sound of a ticking clock, no sign of approaching disaster. The ending began, like all endings do, invisibly. Beneath that calm surface, however, changes were gathering, subtle, slow, but steady. The planet's internal pulse had grown louder. Volcanic fields in regions like what would one day become India had entered an active phase, releasing enormous volumes of gas into the atmosphere. For thousands of years, the Deccan traps poured lava across the land, creating plateaus hundreds of meters thick. Each eruption filled the air with carbon dioxide and sulfur, altering the balance of the atmosphere. At first, the changes were minor, a few degrees warmer here, a little less rainfall there. But across millions of years, those small shifts added up. The climate of the late Cretaceous began to waver. Some regions grew drier. Rainforests retreated slightly, replaced by open woodlands. Seasons became more pronounced. The lushness that had defined the earlier Cretaceous started to thin. Not everywhere, not dramatically, but gradually, like the slow fading of a color from a painting. Still, life adapted. New plants evolved to handle the changes. The flowering species that had spread across the world diversified even further, thriving where the older cycads and ferns struggled. Evolution did not stop. It never does. It simply adjusted its tempo. For the dinosaurs, these fluctuations were a challenge, but not a catastrophe. They had weathered such changes before. When food became scarce in one region, herds moved to another. When rain failed for a season, new migrations began. The predators followed. Life continued to flow along the lines carved by instinct and adaptation. In the short span of a lifetime, nothing seemed unusual. The cycles of birth and death carried on, and the great herds still roamed as they always had. But the environment was becoming more volatile. As the planet's inner fires burned, gases built up in the air and water. The oceans absorbed much of the carbon dioxide, becoming slightly more acidic. Tiny marine organisms that form the base of the food chain, the plankton and shell builders, began to show stress. In some regions, species declined. In others, new forms appeared. The balance shifted subtly, unpredictably. The ocean's chemistry, once stable, started to waver. These were small changes, the kind no animal could notice, yet they mattered. The Earth was quietly rearranging itself. The continents continued their slow drift. Ocean currents altered their paths. Winds carried moisture differently. Storms grew stronger in some regions, weaker in others. The pattern of life, once perfectly tuned, was beginning to stretch. It didn't break. Not yet. But it was under tension. On the surface, everything still looked normal. A late Cretaceous morning would have been bright and full of sound. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. Birds, true descendants of the dinosaurs themselves, called from branches and darted through sunlight. Herds of Triceratops grazed along the riverbanks, their horns gleaming with dew. A mother Tyrannosaurus led her young through tall grass, their eyes alert for movement. Across the horizon, pterosaurs wheeled lazily, their silhouettes dark against the sky. The world was alive, completely unaware that it stood on the edge of history's most violent boundary. In these final millennia, the diversity of life was astonishing. More species existed on Earth than at almost any point before. The planet was at its ecological peak, and that is often how endings arrive. Not with decline, but with abundance. The richer the system, the more complex the web, the more fragile it becomes when disturbed. The world was filled to its limits, and the smallest imbalance could ripple across everything. In the forests, the air was still thick and warm. Ferns and other animals sparkling their scents of awe and terror around them. Flowering plants shared the ground in tangled mats. Dragonflies glided above shallow pools. Lizards and small mammals hunted insects in the undergrowth. At night, the air cooled only slightly, heavy with moisture, filled with the faint hum of life, continuing its endless rhythm. Every sound, every breath, every footstep carried the illusion of permanence. The dinosaurs were thriving, but some patterns hinted at unease. Fossil evidence from this period shows fluctuations in population sizes. Certain herbivores became less common in some areas, while others grew more dominant. Predators shifted their ranges, perhaps following changing prey. Sea levels fluctuated, drowning some habitats and revealing others. Evolution continued to react to an environment that was no longer predictable. But evolution requires time, and time was running out. Far above this living world, beyond the clouds, beyond the blue haze of atmosphere, a small object had been traveling for a long time. It was ancient, a fragment of rock and metal left over from the formation of the solar system, orbiting silently between worlds. For millions of years, it had wandered the outer reaches of space, caught in the slow gravity of planets and the faint pressure of space. Sunlight. It had no destination, no purpose, until something, perhaps the pull of Jupiter's gravity, perhaps a collision long forgotten, sent it on a new course. A line through the dark that intersected perfectly with Earth. No creature on the planet could have seen it coming. The air was clear, the seas calm, the forests peaceful. But in the high reaches of the atmosphere, invisible to all living eyes, that ancient rock was already beginning to glow. Still on the surface, life went on. the last generations of dinosaurs, lived as their ancestors had for millions of years. Herds migrated across open plains. Raptors hunted in coordinated bursts. In the oceans, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs patrolled the depths, unaware that their realm, too, was part of what would soon change. Even the insects, those tireless survivors of every previous catastrophe, continued their quiet labor, pollinating, decomposing, building, feeding. Nothing in the behavior of the planet suggested an ending. If anything, the world seemed more alive than ever. The fossil record shows that in the final 1,000 years of the Cretaceous, new species were still evolving. In North America, new varieties of Triceratops appeared. In the seas, ammonites developed increasingly ornate shells. On land, flowering plants continued to diversify, spreading into regions once dominated by older flora. The pulse of evolution did not slow. It never does until it must. The planet itself seemed unaware of its own schedule. Volcanoes erupted sporadically. Rivers meandered through forests. The tides rose and fell. The weather followed its ancient patterns, driven by forces deep within the earth and far beyond it. Everything was normal. Everything was alive. And yet, in the language of geology, the world had entered its last page of that age. The clock had begun its final seconds. Though to every living creature, those seconds stretched into generations. It's strange to imagine the calm before such an ending. Not the silence before a storm, but the steady, unaware continuation of life. The great predators sleeping in the shade. The birds tending their nests. The herds grazing beneath the same sun that would soon be obscured. The earth had seen extinctions before, and it would see them again. But this one would come from outside, from beyond its atmosphere, from a place no creature could ever reach or understand. The approaching object, the asteroid, was still far from sight. It traveled silently, faster than anything Earth had ever known. Its surface was scarred, its body ancient and cold. As it drew closer, the gravity of the planet pulled it faster. Still, the air ahead of it compressed, heating to temperatures that turned night into day. But none of this had yet happened in the time we were imagining. We're still standing in the last quiet days when the forests still grew, when the seas still shimmered, when the dinosaurs still ruled the land without rival. The planet from space would have looked beautiful. Green continents, blue oceans, white clouds, the same palette we see today. The patterns of wind and water that shaped the surface were familiar. If you could have watched from orbit, nothing about it would suggest that this was a doomed world. It rotated slowly under the sun, glowing with life, every inch of it busy with growth and motion. But on its path through space, invisible in the endless black, the asteroid was already falling toward it. The final day of the Cretaceous began like any other. The air was warm, the sun bright, in what would one day be called the Yucatan Peninsula. Tropical forest stretched toward a shallow sea. The morning light filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in golden shadow. Animals moved through the trees, hunting, feeding, calling. The ground was soft from recent rain. The air smelled of earth and salt. There was no reason to notice anything unusual. The planet seemed entirely at peace. A few hours later, a streak appeared in the sky. To any creature that looked up, would have seemed strange but brief. A bright line across the heavens, moving faster than sound. It may have cast shadows even in daylight, Birds scattered from the trees. Some animals looked up, confused by the flash of light that lasted only seconds. And then the world changed forever. The asteroid entered the atmosphere at nearly 70,000 kilometers per hour. The air in front of it compressed violently, heating to temperatures that turned the object into a white-hot sun. It exploded through the sky, leaving behind a column of fire that stretched from space to the surface. In its final seconds, it struck the Earth with the energy of billions of atomic bombs. But that impact, that incomprehensible moment, belongs to what comes next. For now, we are still in the last instant before it happens. The herds are still grazing. The forests are still breathing. The air is still thick with the sounds of life. Every creature on the planet is living its last normal moment. The planet holds its breath, though no one can feel it. The hidden pulse beneath the crust, the rhythms of the green world, the movements of the oceans, all continue in perfect order. The Earth is unaware, just as its inhabitants are unaware, that the clock has struck the invisible hour. In the great scheme of time, it is only a heartbeat, a blink, the final calm before a storm that will erase almost everything. But in that blink, the world is complete, beautiful, alive, and at peace. The last rays of sunlight pass through the forests, through the wings of pterosaurs gliding over the sea, through the scales of a sleeping giant resting beneath the trees. Shadows stretch across the land. The air is still. The day ends, like every other, and somewhere above the clouds, unseen, the end of an age is already descending. The asteroid that would end the Cretaceous entered the atmosphere in silence. There was no warning, no tremor, no light visible long enough to interpret. It came from beyond the blue, from the cold dark between worlds, drawn inward by gravity and inevitability. A visitor from the void, ancient, indifferent, carrying no malice, no intention, only momentum. Its story was as old as the solar system itself, a fragment of rock and metal that had drifted for millions of years. A relic of the time when planets were still forming, when everything was collisions and dust and fire. By the time it reached the edge of the atmosphere, it was traveling faster than any sound the Earth had ever produced. The air in front of it didn't have time to move aside. It was crushed, compressed, and heated until it glowed like the surface of the sun. For a moment, the entire sky above what would one day be Mexico became brighter than daylight. Creatures on the ground froze, blinded by the sudden flash. Birds took off in panic. Animals scattered into the forest. In that instant, the planet's surface met an object that had been on its way for tens of millions of years. The impact happened near the shallow waters of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the sea met low coastal forests. The asteroid, about 10-kilometer wide, struck at an angle, releasing an energy beyond comprehension. The blast was equivalent to billions of nuclear explosions. In less than a second, the object vaporized along with the rock, water, and atmosphere around it. A crater more than 180 kilometers across was gouged into the crust. The bedrock melted. Shock waves rippled outward faster than sound, racing through land and ocean alike. The explosion tore apart the atmosphere. A column of vaporized rock and molten debris shot upward, piercing the sky, rising through the stratosphere and beyond. Within minutes, material from the impact began falling back to Earth as glowing, fragments raining down across continents. The friction of their re-entry turned the upper atmosphere into a furnace. For a short time, perhaps less than an hour, the entire surface of the planet glowed dimly in infrared light, heated by the returning debris. Forests ignited spontaneously. The air shimmered with heat. Everything alive beneath that sky experienced it in a different way. The creatures nearest the impact never had time to know what had happened. The blast wave flattened everything for hundreds of kilometers, leveling forests, boiling seas, and hurling debris across the landscape. Further away, the shock arrived as a wall of wind and sound that tore through the air, toppling trees and scattering herds. Those who survived that first instant faced something worse: a rain of fire. Tiny droplets of molten rock, ejected from the impact and cooled into glass as they fell, rained from the sky for hours. These spherules covered the ground, burned forests, and filled the air with dust and ash. The planet that had been green and bright were suddenly lit by countless fires. Even creatures far from the impact felt the heat. The surface temperature rose sharply, and the air filled with smoke dense enough to blot out the sun. In the oceans, the shock was different, but no less devastating. A wave, hundreds of meters high, raced outward from the impact site. It crossed entire seas, hitting coastlines with unimaginable force. Coral reefs, beaches, and coastal forests were ripped apart. The wave carried debris, rock, trees, carcasses far inland, then retreated, leaving chaos in its wake. The noise was constant, unending, a low roar that rolled across the planet for days. The fires burned for weeks. Vast regions of forest turned to ash. The smoke mixed with vaporized rock and sulfur from the impact, forming a dense cloud layer that encircled the planet. The sunlight dimmed, then disappeared entirely. The day turned into a dim twilight that lasted for months. Photosynthesis stopped. The green world went silent. Animals that depended on plants for food starved first. Herbivorous dinosaurs, so vast and powerful in life, could not find enough to eat. Their massive bodies, built for abundance, were too large for scarcity. One by one, the herds weakened. Predators, deprived of prey, followed. The ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years collapsed in a matter of weeks. The smaller creatures fared better. Mammals, birds, insects, and reptiles that could hide, burrow, or go dormant stood a chance. Their size became their advantage. They needed less, could survive longer, could eat what others could not. In the darkness, the rules of survival changed. The titans that had ruled the land were no longer suited to the world that remained. The planet had tilted toward the small and the adaptable. The ocean life suffered its own catastrophe. The debris that filled the atmosphere eventually settled into the seas, mixing with acid rain produced by the chemical reactions in the air. The surface waters grew acidic, dissolving the shells of plankton and corals. The foundation of the marine food chain broke apart. For a time, the oceans were quiet, empty of movement, except for the slow drifting of the dead. Yet even in the midst of this devastation, the planet itself continued its slow rhythms. The tectonic plates moved, volcanoes erupted, rivers shifted their courses. Life did not stop entirely at some. It simply hid. Seeds buried in the soil waited for sunlight to return. Burrowing animals clung to the warmth underground. Insects found shelter in the crevices of bark and stone. The earth, though wounded, was still alive. Its hidden pulse continued. After the first few weeks, the fires began to fade. The smoke that had darkened the skies spread across the entire planet, blocking sunlight almost completely. Global temperatures dropped sharply. The heat of the fires gave way to a sudden bitter cold. The world entered what scientists call an impact winter, a period when the sun's light was so reduced that photosynthesis nearly ceased. For months, perhaps years, the surface of the planet was dim and freezing. Snow fell even in tropical regions. The air grew still, heavy with dust and ash. The once loud world became quiet. The forests, stripped of leaves and branches, stood like blackened skeletons. The great rivers slowed, choked with debris. The ocean's surface cooled, and life retreated into the depths. Everything that had thrived in the warmth of the Cretaceous now faced a silence that stretched beyond comprehension. In that silence, the survivors waited. Some creatures, like small mammals, fed on roots, insects, or anything they could find. Birds that could eat seeds endured the darkness longer than those that fed on insects. Crocodiles, turtles, and amphibians survived in the water, their slow metabolisms allowing them to endure scarcity. Life's persistence was not dramatic. It was quiet, cautious, almost invisible. The impact had reshaped the world physically as well. The crater that formed in the Yucatan became a scar hundreds of kilometers wide, later buried under layers of sediment, but never gone. The shockwave fractured the crust for thousands of kilometers, triggering volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. Tsunami deposits can still be found in rock layers across continents, evidence of the waves that reached as far as what is now North America's interior. The planet itself bore the memory of the event in every layer of stone. Months passed, then years. The dust in the atmosphere slowly began to settle. Sunlight, faint and filtered, returned in thin beams. The fires were gone, replaced by frost. The earth was no longer warm and humid. It was pale and dry. The great age of dinosaurs was over, but the planet itself remained. When sunlight finally returned fully, it was weak at first. The atmosphere had been permanently changed. The high levels of carbon dioxide and sulfur altered the climate, making it unpredictable. The forest did not regrow evenly. Some areas recovered, others stayed barren. But wherever life had managed to survive, in burrows, in the deep sea, in seeds, it began to emerge again. The first green shoots appeared on the ashen ground, small and fragile, but alive. The age that followed would belong to the descendants of those survivors. Mammals, which had lived in the shadows for so long, began to diversify. Birds, the only surviving dinosaurs, filled the skies that had once belonged to their ancestors. The earth began to rebuild slowly, patiently, as it always had. But for a long time, the silence remained. The extinction that followed the impact wiped out about 3/4 of all species on Earth. Almost every large animal vanished. The dinosaurs that had ruled the land, the great reptiles of the seas, the flying pterosaurs, all gone. The world that emerged after was smaller, emptier, but open to new possibilities. The planet had turned a page, not out of choice, but because that is what time does. The visitor from the void had not intended destruction. It was a simple consequence of motion, of physics, of chance. It carried no awareness of what it had done. After striking the earth, most of it vaporized, becoming part of the air and water it destroyed. The rest sank into the molten rock beneath the crater. Its journey ended, but the story it triggered continued for millions of years. In the grand scale of time, the impact was brief. Seconds of violence that reshaped the planet for eons. Age of Titans ended in fire and darkness, and from that darkness, the future began. Every species that exists now traces its survival, directly or indirectly, to those few that endured the aftermath. The world we live in is the child of that catastrophe. Even now, the Earth remembers. Layers of clay enriched with iridium, a metal rare on the planet's surface, but common in asteroids, mark the boundary and rock formations across the globe. It is a line that separates two eras. The world before, filled with giants, and the world after, filled with new beginnings. To stand before that line in stone is to look at the moment when everything changed. For the planet, it was another transformation in a long series. For life, it was the Great Reset. The visitor from the void had come and gone, leaving behind silence, darkness, and eventually renewal. If you imagine the Earth in the weeks after spinning slowly under a dim sky, you would see a planet wrapped in shadow. The oceans would reflect little light. The continents would be gray and bare. The sound of life would be faint. The scurrying of small creatures, the whisper of wind through dead trees, the soft lapping of waves against empty shores. But somewhere in that silence, life was still breathing. The same stubborn, patient force that had survived every previous extinction was already beginning to move again. It is easy to see the impact as an ending, but in the language of the planet, it was a change. The Earth does not grieve, and it does not remember the way we do. It simply continues. Its pulse, hidden deep within, never faltered. The continents drifted, the seas calmed, the air cleared, and in time, the sunlight returned and the world began again. What the dinosaurs left behind was not just bones, but the foundation for what would come next.